compliment the group, the Abhivyakti group. First of all, for the initiative itself, Abhivyakti initiative itself, having development dialogue or development discourse, right? So, and as I was telling earlier, right? So we seem to be veering more and more towards management and business orientation. But to me, rural management is a blend of both, right? As conceived here, as understood here, right? As practiced also is a blend of both, right? And that blend we should maintain, and these kind of debates are definitely helpful, because ultimate objective of rural management is development in whatever way one may define, right? So therefore we deserve the compliments for taking this initiative. Second, of course, I again compliment you in having this topic and inviting Dr. Nitya, right? It's of course a basic topic on a basic problem, which many of us think that we have resolved it. No, the problem has not been resolved. It still remains a challenge, particularly for countries like India. And with COVID, it has worsened. So therefore, having this debate on such a basic problem, developmental problem, is in that sense really a worthy effort, right? And that to this time. And I can say therefore nobody can be better suited to talk on such a theme than Dr. Nitya Rao, right? I have read her papers, paper on gender, food security, etc., right? And I know even on issues like land rights, sometimes she used to advocate an alternative view. There is some apparently conventional view on land rights. Land rights must be given to women, particularly, but she holds an alternative view in one of her papers, which I had read in a book edited by Maitreyi Krishna Raj, right, in South India. So she had reflected an alternative view. Yeah, maybe land rights are important, but they may not help resolve women empowerment or even food security for that matter, because it's a more complex issue. So we need to probably take much broader or a holistic view. That's possibly was our argument, if I recall the paper that I had read. Yeah, so therefore, one with such a kind of an alternative view, and today we need in development, of course, development discourse is also having alternative views. So therefore, on such a basic topic, on a basic problem, I fully agree with your selection, right? Selection of the speaker, right? I'm sure she will bring out some of those alternative ideas also with regard to gender and food security. Yeah. So let me briefly share some of my thoughts very briefly, because I am no expert, right? But since the organizers told me that I should say a few things, right? Yeah, of course, when the issue of food security, whenever it is debated, what comes up to our mind, like, is all these images on TV, the food stocks of the Food Corporation of India, and we are shown that, yeah, we are having so much of food. We are probably a food secure country. We have resolved our food security problem. Those kinds of notions are depicted, narratives are depicted, right? But the reality apparently is different, right? So even, of course, the notion of food security as is again conventionally defined by taking household as an unit. Household as an unit having access to affordable and accessible food is seen as food security. But we know that household also has several kinds of composition by age, by gender, etc. So therefore, we should not be simply going by that general notion that if we take care of household, if we give food to household, everybody's food security needs are taken care of. That is one paradox also in the notion of food security. And then, of course, the second one is again going by the food stocks. Like last year we had I think 295 million tons of food production and about 75 million tons of food stock, right? So again, the same notions, right? But the underlying realities are different, right? Underlying realities are different. So even this increased food stock with Food Corporation of India, it is argued, is a result of the declining demand because of the declining real incomes, right? So the actual food grain availability per capita, calorie intake per capita are going down actually if one carefully looks at it. Of course, there are some very serious research also have been done. Scholars have worked on it, right? Therefore, those realities are not captured by these kinds of pictures. So even, of course, from the gender point of view, the recent National Family Health Survey of 2016 brings out, and it very clearly tells that on the issue of malnutrition, which is also an important dimension of food security, India is still lagging behind. The levels are very, very high, higher than the expected or desirable levels. We still have a long way to go. Therefore, indicators like IRMA, right, infant mortality rate still is fairly high, and there is a gender disparity. And then even issues like anemia, right? Again, there is a major gender disparity. Of course, biased against women. Both the indicators, if you look at, they show a very clear gender kind of a bias, right? So therefore, we need to understand these intricate challenges which are still unresolved, right? Including, of course, the gender dimension that is there in understanding food security. Of course, what we have done recently is one can say commendable in some sense, that we are having this NFS, National Food Security Act, right? Which definitely is a progressive step, but it has also its own limitations. We also are having MG Narega. Both are right-based approaches, entitlement-based approaches. But again, their coverage and working, there are a lot to be desired, right? So therefore, so even though we have these approaches, I don't think they are in a position to fully address the food security needs in the holistic way. Though NFSA defines food security based on life cycle approach, even individually, including for pregnant and lactating women, right? But their working and coverage, as I said, is still a lot needs to be done to make them work better. And COVID, of course, has worsened the situation. My own understanding of working of PDS right now, I've been conducting a study in a village, tribal village, at least 2 villages. In a tribal village, pre-COVID, post-COVID, the working of PDS has suffered actually. In fact, corruption also has come in, because government says they'll give food freely now, right? Earlier, they would charge at least 1 rupee, 2 rupee, 3 rupee per kilo, but now it is free. So therefore, the PDS the stockists are taking money also, right? So the corruption has come. So therefore, there are problems of that kind, and hence we are in some sense therefore sitting on a powder cage. Therefore, I'm really happy that you are organizing this talk, and I'm sure Dr. Nitya will be able to bring out some of these issues well, and we are in a position to understand this challenge well, also under COVID, and probably fight it with better clarity and conviction. Yeah. So thanks for this opportunity. I look forward to listening to Dr. Nitya.
Thank you, sir. So just before, thank you so much for your insightful and thank you for setting up the context before we invite Nitya ma'am. So before starting with Nitya ma'am's lecture, I would just like to give a brief introduction of Nitya ma'am. So Professor Nitya Rao, not many of us know, but she was she has been our alumni from PRM 4 batch. Now getting into her work, so she has basically been a researcher, a teacher, trainer, and social activist, basically committed to gender equality and women's empowerment, with broader issues covering resource rights, social equity, and even rural development. She has also written a book called Good Women Do Not Inherit Land, Politics of Land and Gender in India, which was published in 2008 and republished in 2012. So apart from that, she has done a lot of work on gender and land-based issues. Then over the past 3 years, she has been working with many global level groups as well. She has coordinated with UNRISD for a research project called When and Why Do States Respond to Women's Claims, Understanding Gender Egalitarian Policy Change in USA. And also she has been engaged with 2 of the major research consortiums. The first one is LANSA, which is Leveraging Agriculture for Nutrition in South Asia. And the other one is Yeah, other one is the ASAR, Adaptation at Sale in Semi-Arid Regions, which is under CARIER, that is the Collaborative Adaptation Research Initiative in Africa and Asia. So she has a lot of experience and she has done a lot of research work in this sector. So I'll keep it brief and I'll hand over to Nitya Rao ma'am, who's currently a professor in Gender and Development sector in University of East Anglia, UK. So over to you, ma'am. We request you to share your experiences with us. Thank you so much for coming here today and giving us your time. Thank you so much. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. I think, again, I'm not getting a share screen option on my, I mean, it's not allowing me to select anything. So maybe if one of you can pull up my slides, but I'll just want to thank you also for contacting me. And I think one of your colleagues I met in Delhi earlier this year in February. And then she had spoken to me and she wrote to say that,
Yes,
would I do a talk? So I think it's really nice to meet with all of you. It really takes me back to my days at IRMA, which was, of course, long time back. It was BRM 4. We were the first to occupy the beautiful campus and had to cooperate with the management to actually make sure that the grass was growing and things like that. But I just wanted to say that actually my interest in gender, before that, I had also come to IRMA. I was interested in rural development and rural management issues, but I didn't necessarily have an interest in gender. But when I was in IRMA, in our batch, actually it was very mismatched. In those days, it was the 4th batch, and there was a majority of boys and very few women students. So one of our teachers at that time, the late Dr. Kamla Chaudhary, who was teaching us about behavior and so on. She then, when we were finishing, she said to me that since there are so few women graduates of management, why don't you join a women's organization? And IRMA, in our batch, was the first one which had actually started asking the IRMA that can we also have placement in NGOs and in non-cooperatives. So it was the first time that we brought in NGOs list of recommended organizations. Kamla Chaudhary said to me that there is SEWA, Self-Employed Women's Association in Ahmedabad. It is a women's trade union. And basically they're trying to professionalize. Till then, it was very much a Gandhian welfare, a trade union organization. But they were bringing in cooperatives and they needed some kind of trained professional management people. And would I join? And I did actually. Joined SEWA, and I worked with SEWA after leaving IRMA for about 6 years. And that was interesting journey because it was a women's organization and it was very much fighting for women's rights. I worked for some time in Ahmedabad, then shifted to Jabalpur, and we set up a BD workers cooperative, women BD workers cooperative. But at that time, it was very interesting that when we were going to the communities and talking to the communities, actually BD rolling was a family activity, not just women's activity. So in some of these households, men, women, children, everybody were rolling BDs. So many of the men also said to us, ki, hum bhi BD roll kar rahe hain, we are getting also exploited, not getting adequate wages. So why don't you include us? And it was SEWA policy, of course, that it was only a women's organization and we will only include women. And I think that got me into thinking around some of the bigger issues around gender. That is gender really about relationships between men and women and not only about women? Of course, women's rights is one component of it, but gender relations is something beyond. And we got into this debate with SEWA as well. And SEWA was not willing. They said, no, our mandate is to organize women workers and we are not prepared to take a broader view. And I think probably some of this is what Dr. Shailendra was hinting at when he referred to sort of me going slightly against the grain, because actually within the women's movement and which I have been a part of right from that time, but if you sort of say that we need to also, sometimes, which is happening now much more, that we are really interested in gender equality. We're interested in much more equal relationships between men and women. We're not interested in giving, separate, equal rights, yes. But we need a society which will recognize both and treat both, give equal opportunities, treat both the same. We live in a society where, we are all there, and therefore we can't create a little bubble or a little separate thing for women. I mean, women have to be enabled to integrate and work efficiently and effectively and satisfactorily in the larger society. So I think this was something that came up at that time. That was 5 or 6 years after I left IRMA. I got very much interested in really looking, and it came from the community. I had no idea till then. It came very much from the community, working with the communities. A lot of men, lot of women also were saying, "Ki hamare pati ko bhi le lo, hamare bete ko le lo." So there was a lot of cooperation also at a very poor, within poor society, and amongst the poorer groups particularly. And anyway, thereafter, I went on to do, after 6-7 years with Seva, went on to do a master's in gender and development, and then got much more into it, both in terms of practice as well as in terms of academic work. So I think, as Dr. Shailendra said, I started working, of course, with women's employment because I was with Seva. So I was very much interested in issues of work and equality in the workplace. And then it moved when I started working in Jharkhand around, actually it was Bihar then, South Bihar, 1994, now 25 years, more than 25 years. It was with issues of land and with issues of forest and land, because it was rural women, tribal women. And that's when I got interested in the issue of land. And after working for several years on the ground, again, the politics of that was very interesting, but I don't have time to go into those stories today. If anybody has questions, I'm happy to respond later. But it really took me to the whole issue of land, forests, climate, agriculture, farming, and so on. Because with Seva, of course, was more urban-based. We were working with urban informal sector women workers. So I got back into the rural, actually. And thereafter have continued working with those issues. With academia, of course, I have my position. I'm now in the School of International Development at University of East Anglia. But I also engage a lot with research and with field level organizations and groups still. In fact, right now I'm working very closely with Pradhan, and we are working in Bihar and Jharkhand on actually issues of sustainable food systems. So the last 7 or 8, 10 years, maybe, I have been focusing, moving on. I mean, all these are contributing towards a sense of food security, household food security, issues of household well-being, that what do people actually work for? What do they want resources for? You have, of course, social ambitions of mobility and so on, of doing something, but there is also the whole issue of meeting basic needs, especially for poor communities. This is very important. So I'll start my talk, and then later on we can come back to discuss any issues. I think my slides have kind of gone off. Yeah. Could you put it into a slideshow mode? Yeah. Next slide, please. So I want to quickly run through. I'm right now also since the last 1 year on a term with what we call as what is called as the high-level panel of experts to the Global Commission on Food Security. And this is based, headquartered in FAO, but the Commission on Food Security is basically an interstate group with heads of state or agricultural ministers of state who debate on issues of food security. And so we are independent of the FAO. We are not a bureaucracy, but the Commission on Food Security, which is really a political body, the secretariat of which is an FAO, it's an interstate body. They set up something called a high-level panel of experts. They give us requests on issues for which they need support in terms of research, and we are supposed to be basically a scientific body which provides them evidence-based research. So the most recent has been an issues paper on the impact of food and nutrition security due to COVID, which is actually October 14th, 15th is the meeting of the Commission on Food Security, where it will be presented by 2 of my colleagues, the COVID issues paper. But also this year, we did a report called, looking at the last 10 years really, and all our own reports of the high-level panel of experts on called the global narrative. And I'll talk a little bit about, our thinking within this. So I'll give you some of our latest thinking on food and nutrition security. This report was launched in June, but it's going to be tabled and discussed by the Commission on Food Security next week. And then little bit about trends and challenges and about gender relations and how these are gendered and what are potential pathways for moving ahead. So next slide, please. So I think here I draw on this latest report. This is online, the high-level panel report of experts report 15, which is called Food Security and Nutrition, Building a Global Narrative Towards 2030. Because 2030 is, of course, when the Sustainable Development Goals are till. And there are these four pillars which we have identified as part of this, if you have to move towards food security and nutrition. One is that the right to food as a fundamental human right. So this is, of course, been there for a long time, but we really need to see how is it working and improve its functionality. Then secondly is a wider, and I'll go through each of these points, wider understandings of the dimensions of food security, adopt a food systems perspective, and also embrace critical policy shifts. So I'll go through each of them in turn. Next, please. So in terms of the right to food, I think that this has a long history. Right from 1948, it was recognized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and subsequently at different declarations. I think the key moment was really the 1996 Rome Declaration on World Food Security, which is sort of also the standard definition of food security, which is used. And this was again reaffirmed 5 years later, the World Food Summit. And thereafter, the FAO Council produced or adopted this right to food guidelines. So this was a guidelines on how do you implement the right to food, because the difference between a law and a policy, of course, is that the legal framework is what is justiciable, what is a right, and then you need to convert that right into some kind of a policy which is implementable. But despite this, so if you look at it, 2004, so FAO Council is again a political body of states. So these states adopted it, all our states, including India. And of course, but then you think that implementation of the right to food, what happens? Then once you adopt this, then each country has to legislate or bring out some policy or whatever. So if you look at Indian case, 2004, it was adopted, but actually 2013, we ended up, and around that time, the right to food campaign started and so on, or slightly earlier. And 2013, we had the National Food Security Act, which was legally adopted, and then the practice of it started. But still, there is a lot of work. I think I'm not going to go into an analysis of NFSA today, but a lot of work that still needs to be done to uphold this as a fundamental right. Next, please. So the second point was really about what are the dimensions of food and nutrition security. So on the right is really the definition that was adopted at this World Food Summit in 1996, that food security is a situation that exists when all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. So it includes a lot of things. And originally, conceptually or theoretically, there were four aspects which were highlighted by the World Food Summit. That was availability, access, utilization, and stability. So availability is really that you have sufficient food. And this is what the National Food Security Act, or the food stocks, which Dr. Shailendra was referring to, and the public distribution system, it ensures that there is enough availability, improvement in production, green revolution technologies, efficiency, and so on, is really about availability. The second element is access. Which is physical, social, and economic access. And I think this has been very interesting. And this really starts bringing in a more gender or a socially differentiated perspective. That physical access, where do you live? So if you're in a remote rural area like Jharkhand, in a tribal village, on top of a hill, you hardly have access to PDS in any case. Social access, and we have read a lot about this, that how different caste groups, whether you're SC, ST, or are affected or are positioned within access. So we have analysis of PDS even, that, while everybody is entitled, but the Dalits will be made to stand separately, or they will have to be last in the queue, or whatever. And of course, economic access is very important. This is affordability. So even for the very poor, when I was doing my field research, and in fact, in my book, I have written about it in Jharkhand on the land book, that even there, food security was very important. And I had written that some of these very poor women or single women, they were not really buying from the PDS. And my research was done in 98, 99, when we didn't have the NFSA. But even the ration shops, I think they had to pay something. And many of these women would say that because we have to buy 15 kilos or 20 kilos together, so even at 3 rupees, 4 rupees, that costs, you have to have at least 100 rupees, 150 rupees, 200 rupees in cash in order to be able to go and buy. And they said that we can't afford it. We don't have that much money in cash. Those days, the agricultural wage rates were much lower. I'm talking about 98, so 20 years ago. It was 50, 60 rupees. So they said that, we just buy half a kilo, 1 kilo, whatever we need in terms of our immediate cash flow. So I think economic access. And the latest report of the state of food produced by the FAO this year in June, every year they have a latest report. It actually shows that there is no connection actually between the poverty line and the access to what we call as a nutritious, safe and healthy diet. So with the minimum wage or with poverty line and with all the social protection like NFSA, you can probably get enough food to eat. So you won't be hungry. But basically, you're only getting carbohydrates or rice or wheat. But if we talk about a balanced diet or a nutritious diet or a healthy diet, then it has to be diverse. It has to include some dal, it has to include some vegetables, it has to include some protein. And to actually that kind of a diet, the calculations in that report are very interesting. They show that you need at least 4 times the income of what we define as a poverty line. So in a country like India, if we say 28 or 29 or 30% are below the poverty line, but almost 60 to 70% of our people cannot have a safe, nutritious and healthy diet that meets all the dietary needs. So that's very stark. That's quite a stark figure. The third element is around utilization, which is really about absorption of nutrients and about bodily functioning and about health and good health. And I think this is the point that I just spoke about, that even our National Food Security Act does not enable us to really have a diverse and a nutritious and a healthy diet. Some states have done, like Chhattisgarh, they have included 1 kilo of dal. Karnataka has included ragi and millets. So there are states which are trying to include this safe and nutritious diet. The Food Security Act allows for it, but at the very minimum, most states haven't done it, and especially the states that need it most. The final point, a recognized point, was the stability. And stability is basically, something which you should know in rural areas and rural management, if you've done field work, that there is seasonality, of course, that, we have, after the harvest, you have good food and you have sufficient food and you have money. But then by the time it comes to the summer or the dry months, people are going hungry. So this is about stability, that how do we ensure access to food right through the year. So in our report, using the same definition, we have actually added 2 more points conceptually, that is agency and sustainability. So what do we mean by agency? Agency is really the ability of individual choices or people to exercise some kind of choice in terms of preference for food, or in terms of, are we really looking at all people? So are we ignoring anybody? Are we looking at household as a unit and ignoring the needs of, specific groups of people and so on? And I think this was very interesting, that during the COVID lockdown and many of the, stories that were coming out, including from Gujarat, that people were being given food packets, and many of the labor, actually we did a paper which is forthcoming, I think soon, on stranded migrants. And I think the stories using mobile based this thing, we contacted them, and it was very interesting that most of them said food was a problem. And they also said that even when they stand in lines to get food from NGOs and so on, this is not according to their taste. They want bhat. A lot of them coming from Bihar, Jharkhand, Eastern India, they want rice, and they were being given rotis or rotlis or something else, and they were not really feeling that they have eaten. So I think this whole issue of culture, of agency, of food preferences is very important, and taste. And the other, of course, is the longer term issue of sustainability. So we're not only talking about short term, about seasonality within a year, but I think today, in the context of climate change, in the context of other threats, we have to also think about production systems. So it's not just short term having enough food, but how do we have long term also ensure enough food. Okay, so if we go to the next element in terms of the next slide, please. In terms of also this whole issue of household, the scale at which we are looking at. So what is the scale at which, this is the third element really in terms of looking at the scale of food security and nutrition. And this diagram I've just taken from the World Food Program actually. It's not a very new diagram, but it was really looking at food security and nutrition at household or individual levels. So at the bottom, they have livelihoods, the various capitals or assets, and then a whole set of blue things that, you know, in terms of household food production, gifts, exchange, how people acquire food, cash, so you can go and buy in the market, loans, savings, transfers from the state, which is PDS. But I think what's very interesting from a gender lens is the three yellow boxes, that from moving from this kind of household level, what comes in, to individual level nutrition of food security, there are three aspects. One is the household food access is important. Second, very important, is care, what we call as care or health practices. What is care? Care is typically in India seen as part of women's work. It includes the whole set of activities which we call as reproductive labor or domestic labor, which is about, you know, fetching the water, fetching the firewood, cooking the food, serving the food, cleaning the utensils, storage, processing, masala pisna, all these kinds of things come under this broad rubric of care activities, which includes all everyday domestic activities as well as conversion of food into raw materials into actually food. So it is more than the food itself. I think there are very interesting studies that where you about the, people may have food in their house, but they go to bed hungry because barish ho gaya, to food firewood was wet. We could not cook. I have experienced that when I was doing my field work in Jharkhand, that it was raining cats and dogs for 3 or 4 days, and we had our ration, of course, but there was no way we could convert it into cooked food. So we had some biscuits and things with us, but a lot of village people didn't have anything. So this intermediate activity, which is primarily women's activity, I'm not saying men don't do it. In a lot of urban areas now, people are getting more aware. There is much more sharing between couples. Men are also cooking, also with, of course, better technology, that you have fridge, you have microwaves, you have gas with multiple range. So aadhe ghante mein, you can finish off things. You can put it into your freezer or a fridge once a week, as they do in the US and other places. I know people in India have also started doing some of this. So there is much more sharing. But traditionally or typically, women are responsible for this whole set of practices. And finally, there's also another level to it when we talk about utilization or absorption, which is your structural factor, which is the political factor, the health and hygiene conditions. Do you have provision of clean drinking water? Do you have provision of sanitation services? Because however well you eat, if you're all the time having worms as a young child, or if you're having diarrhea all the time because of not clean drinking water, then however good food you eat, it is actually pretty useless. So when we move to the level of nutrition, actually, it is both the food intake and your health status, disease status. And I think this is where I really emphasize that even if we are talking about food security at nutrition at a household level, first of all, it's gendered, because it's not just about the food production and accessing, bringing it into the home, but how is it cooked? How is it stored? In many poor households, I have seen that women don't have the time. They're multitasking. They leave a small child, to stir that patila, who doesn't know how to do. There are flies, it's not so clean. It's not so hygienic. So there are lots of issues in terms of care and health practices, and there's also the structural issues in terms of the basic environment. If you fall ill, what is the support? Do you have a primary health center which is properly working or not working? And again, we see during COVID that all the primary health staff have been diverted to COVID response, which was needed. But all these basic things have been completely ignored in terms of immunization, in terms of deworming, in terms of basic, for diarrhea, healthcare, malaria, all these kinds of infectious diseases and so on. So this is one. The second thing is more at a system level. Next, please. Where this is more at a macro level when we are looking at food systems, that the household is something, in the end, yes, in terms of nutrition and health outcomes and the diets, but this is dependent on a host of other system level factors, which is both your environmental factors. So as I said, where do you live? What's the agroecological context? What will grow? Is it a dry area? Is it a forest area? Is it a wet area? What kind of technology and infrastructure is available? What are the markets and the economic drivers? The political and the institutional drivers, socio-cultural factors as well. Like, is there parda? What kind of norms are there? What kind of gender norms are there? How empowered are women? And also other aspects like migration, urbanization, young people leaving, and so on. So there's many drivers that actually influence these food systems, what can be taken in terms of production. So for instance, they say that if all the young people are away and there's no labor, many women in tribal areas in Koraput, in Odisha, told me that, "Nahi, we have to do whatever is easy now. In fact, we are giving to contract farming, to eucalyptus plantations, because our children are all in school and there is nobody to help us with labor, and they stay in hostels and there is nobody to help us with labor, and there is a limit to what we can cultivate." So you may tell us that, grow millets, grow vegetables and so on, but these are very labor intensive. And it's easier for us to give up land to a corporate paper industry, paper mill, let them grow eucalyptus, they will give us some money, and we can pay for the school fees and hostel fees of the children. But in the process, their diets and their health status is really declining. And we have evidence from the National Institute of Nutrition, for instance, that over the last 30 years, the tribal population of central India, their dietary diversity has really declined. Okay, so let me park that for the moment. I'll come back to this conceptual thing, but I want to move a little bit to the gender aspects. Next slide, please. So we know now, I think last 30, 40 years, especially at least after 1995, as I said, in 1980s, when I came to IRMA, it was very male. I mean, management itself was a very male discipline. So from there to today, 40 years, we have moved a lot. I don't know in your batch, I'm presuming that there are equal numbers of girls and boys, but you can tell me that sometime. But there's been a great improvement, of course, in the last 30, 40 years, particularly after 1995, when the 4th World Women's Conference was held in Beijing, where there was the Beijing Platform for Action, and it really pushed policy to take on board the issue of gender difference and gender inequality and move it forward. And in the last 30 years, I would say that there is 25 years now since Beijing this year. No, actually 25 years in this year. There's been a lot of progressive policy change. And in India itself, we see that, there has been the right to education, then Panchayati Raj, equal representation of women. In 2005, there was also the right to inherit property, including agricultural land. This Hindu Succession Act was changed, was amended. The National Food Security Act of 2013, which actually makes woman as the head of the household as far as the Food Security Act is concerned. So while in a patriarchal society like India, we have mainly men are seen as the head of household, the Food Security Act, NFSA, is quite transformative, because it says, at least for the purposes of food security, women should be considered as the head of the household, because it acknowledges that middle box, that women are the ones to convert all this vast raw material into food, which we can eat. The Manrega, of course, which gives equal wages, and actually it helped to bring equal wages and in terms of agricultural wages as well. But still, a number of issues remain. So if you can go to the next slide, please. And I think before talking about these issues, I think just to define what gender equality is really about. And as I said, I think now we don't think about it as just women's rights or equal rights to women, but it is much more beyond that. It is actually about challenging power, about challenging taken for granted norms. And this includes what we call not just women and men per se, but also looking at other kinds of differences like class, caste, ethnicity. So, it can also be not just women versus men, but it is also that how do upper caste women maybe treat Dalit women, or how do, maybe male landlords treat landless male agricultural laborers. So these are also gender relations. I think this is what we argue, that all hierarchies of power is something which we include within our analysis of equality and gender equality or social equality, where we challenge these different kinds of hegemonies of power and norms that are taken for granted. Why should it be that only a Dalit child or only a girl child in primary schools, will bring the water for the teacher or will clean the classroom and so on? Typically, these are seen as women's tasks. So I think all this challenging, recognizing that equity and equality in diversity. So I think this is my point, that that we have to recognize diversity. And I think now even within gender, it is not just about men and women, but I think it is acknowledging different sexualities. So non-binaries, whether in India, of course, it has been quite progressive that trans gender has been officially acknowledged as a third gender, but also other kinds of homosexuality, LGBT, queer, and so on, which has been hugely problematic. I think many of you will be quite aware of these debates, because till very recently, I think in India, there has been debates around it, that even the earlier orders were turned back. There was some regressive, and I think only last year again, the Supreme Court has again overturned it to give recognition to homosexual identity. But otherwise, all these are considered as illegal identities. So just think of that if you are a homosexual, actually you have no rights, because the identity itself, if you want to live the life you want, basically you have no rights, or you're stigmatized. So I think this is the other thing. And the third is a more practical element of redistribution, that when we recognize that there are differences between people, that there are inequalities, that there are different power relations, then we have to make a focused attention to redistributing resources and services to create a level playing field. This is not going to happen automatically until and unless we redistribute resources and services. So I think this is where I don't want to get to, that's a whole other political debate about reservations and so on, and quotas, that should they be there, should they not be there, should they only be merit? But I think people who have worked on the ground, and especially in rural areas and with first generation learners, like I have worked a lot in tribal areas over the last 35 years since I left IRMA, and I therefore feel that if we just leave for open competition, those tribal children, some of them are very bright, but they can never compete unless and until they are given certain resources, certain support, certain access to services to actually create a level playing field. I think you are all aware now. Today we are having this online meeting, but I think there is a lot of debate on online teaching and online discussion, that certain students, including in the IITs, I do a project with IIT Bombay, and I think a lot of their students also come from rural areas, and they were saying to me, the professor with whom I work, that actually, even though they're running everything online, it is quite a problem, because there are people in locations who don't have very good connectivity and who are not able to really connect equally. So I think this online teaching also creates another difference in terms, it doesn't create a level playing field. Next slide, please. So what are the challenges that we still have? As I said, we've made a lot of progress, but I'm going to focus mostly on India. I think the one huge issue, which is around inequality, is about sex ratios. Sex ratios, I don't know if you know what that definition is, basically, is the proportion of female to male in a population, at a population level. So in India, we still find declining, and child sex ratios is an indicator of 0 to 5 or 0 to 6, that we find declining child sex ratios. So the number of girls to the number of boys is declining in the 0 to 5 age group. This is a very worrying trend. And this figure is actually taken from a government source. It is the Economic Survey of India, 2018. Of course, this year there was no economic survey at all, because it was an unusual year. And I think even last year they bypassed it. But in the Economic Survey of India, they actually gave this figure that we still have 21 million unwanted girls. So therefore, the sex ratio is skewed. That if everything was normal, if we had a normal society, then we would have 21 million more girls compared to what we have today. And this has been called as son preference, and for many different reasons. One traditional thing is, inheritance is in the male line. Of course, the Hindu Succession Act changed it. It said girls' daughters can also inherit. But then, the belief that nahi, ladki shadi hoke, she will get married, she will go to her husband's house, and she will look after her in-laws. It is only the son who has to look after the parents. The son has to do the last rites of the parents. So all this ritual business amongst Hindu society, which really creates a son preference. What we are finding now, Economic Survey uses the word meta preference. So actually, we are not using crude methods. So once the child is born, whether it is girls or boys, we are giving them equal opportunities. But we are doing something before they are born to make sure that we have at least one son. So what is this? The first child is okay. A lot of parents will say, ki, whatever it is, girl or boy, it doesn't matter. But if the first one is a daughter, then for the second child, the parents need to make sure that it is a son. And this is what has been called as meta preference. So what parents are doing, why do we find these unwanted girls? That if your first child is a son, then you just stop with one child. So you don't want a second. Because you have one child, you have your preferred child. If the first child is a daughter, then you go for a second. But that is when you try and make sure through various kinds of technologies, even though it is illegal as per the Prenatal Sex Determination Act in India. But still, people try their best to find out what kind of fetus, male or female, and then take action accordingly. And so if you look at this graph, actually the horizontal axis is sex ratio of the last child. So that is, I'm talking about birth order. So second child, third child, fourth child. And here you see that, if you look at this, most of the states in India are above the expected sex ratio when we look at this sex ratio of the last child. Only Meghalaya, MG, is doing well. That because, of course, they have matrilineal inheritance as well. That all children, it doesn't matter which is the birth order, but there is equal chance of girls and boys survival. Then you have a few states, Kerala, Assam, again Manipur, Arunachal, mostly Kerala, but otherwise in the northeast, which are doing reasonably okay. Otherwise, most states are doing very badly when it comes to sex ratio of the last child. But even when we look at sex ratio at birth on the vertical axis, it's a very similar picture. That maybe a few other states like Telangana are doing, somewhat better. But otherwise, Karnataka, but otherwise, you have a majority of states again, and especially the Hindi heartland, Haryana, Punjab, Delhi, Uttarakhand, Rajasthan, Gujarat, doing very badly in terms of sex ratio. So this is really about our social norm, about gender norms, about son preference, which continues to pose a huge challenge to gender equality in India. So apart from this, I think there are another 3 or 4 areas which I want to focus on based on my own work for why, despite all this progress that we have made in education, Panchayati Raj, why women still continue to have poorer health and nutrition outcomes. And in South Asia, actually, this has been called globally the South Asian enigma, that it is not understood that because these countries are doing well economically. The original hypothesis was that if there is money, if there is economic growth, then automatically food security will improve, nutrition will improve, health will improve, and so on. And South Asia has been an enigma, that we have done well on economic growth, but these things haven't improved. And I say that apart from the declining sex ratios, I attribute it to these 3 or 4 other areas, which is devaluation of women's work, unequal access to assets, discriminatory laws, and persistent violence against women. And I think today with Hathras and so on, this has become again a big issue that has come into the limelight. Next slide, please. So I'll look at each of these very quickly. And this is a global exercise again, which was launched last year, actually. which has been called as Equality Measure 2030. And this is a NGO or a group of NGOs globally who are really trying to look at monitoring the SDGs or the Sustainable Development Goals. And across each goal, they are saying, how do we do for gender equality? So they're not saying the gender equality should be looked only at the gender equality goal, which is goal 5, but across these goals. And they say we do very poorly. India does very poorly. And these figures I have only given for India. In SDG 9, that's industry, infrastructure, and innovation. SDG 13, climate action, which is so gendered, but India is doing very poorly. It's also doing very poorly on the gender equality goal itself. And I think this is mainly because of the violence figures on peace and on work. So these areas, I think the equality measure, it acknowledges that we're doing very poorly in terms of women's work, in terms of gender equality, in terms of climate action, and so on. Next slide, please. And I'll just go through this very fast, some of these data, which you can easily find, but this is just data for South Asia. And if you look at India, we are doing the worst in South Asia on undernutrition, not so badly on overweight and obesity, but getting there. I think Pakistan is doing worse on obesity. On anemia, I think we are worst, almost. Our poorer neighbors, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, are doing much better in terms of nutrition, anemia, and so on compared to India. Next. And this is again very similar trends in terms of prevalence of underweight among women of reproductive age. As you can see, Bangladesh, Nepal, and India, both Bangladesh and Nepal, they have had a declining graph. In India, it's been more or less static. Next. But here I come back to my point that when we look at gender, I think we also need to take a much more disaggregated approach. And my interest over the last 25 years has really been with tribal populations, with scheduled tribes in Jharkhand, in Odisha, in other parts, Madhya Pradesh. And what we find from this graph is that if you look at the left, red, which is very, very high prevalence, which is not just the North Indian belt, but interestingly, a lot of the tribal belt of central India. So when we look at scheduled tribes and wasting rates, this is one of the measures. You find in Jharkhand, Purbi Singhbhum, Dumka, Khunti, then Dangs in Gujarat, Gadchiroli in Maharashtra. And this is really a puzzle because actually most of these people belong to rural areas, and also they all have land. Scheduled tribes, unlike Dalits, most scheduled tribe communities are living in remote areas with forest. They have some agricultural land. They are not landless households, and still they are doing so poorly in terms of their nutritional outcomes. I think this is really a puzzle which we need to look at. And this is where my broader dimensions of inequality, which I will talk about in terms of women's work, the lack of support services, and so on, really become key factors in explaining some of these trends. And unfortunately, despite the government of India producing these maps and so on, there's not really an attention to many of these dimensions in terms of the policy frameworks. Next, please. And this is very similar and I think very shocking. Some of the latest reports, again from Government of India, Ministry of Program Implementation and Statistics and World Food Programme. And this map shows that for the poorest 30% in India, the consumption of all food types is below the recommended dietary, what we call as recommended dietary allowance. So it's not just about food security, but it's that is an extra information. But if you look at this largely brown, most of India, except for Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Puducherry, then you find, and maybe if you exclude the light brown of Northeast, in a majority of India, what this means is that the children of 6 to 23 or below 2, only 5 to 10% of children actually have what is the minimum acceptable diet. So 90% of children actually, and the Comprehensive National Nutrition Survey for same ballpark, it said about 6% of children in India have adequate diet below the age of 2. That means 94% of children. That means you take all our social classes and groups, not just very poor. Very poor, 30% have all food types a shortage. But if you look at a balanced and a healthy diet, and I gave you the latest from Sophie report of this year, that if you look at the cost of a healthy, nutritious diet, then 70% of Indians can't afford a balanced, healthy, nutritious diet. And when it comes to children, young children, less than 10% actually have a healthy, nutritious diet. Next, please. So a lot of my interest has been really in looking at the links between rural households involved in agriculture in some way, the gender relations and the gender divisions of work in particular, and nutrition and health outcomes. So, of course, there has been research and from International Food Policy Research Institute and so on, and they have identified multiple pathways that link agriculture and nutrition, that, if you have land, you produce food and therefore you can consume it, but you can also sell some of this and get, you get an income out of it, and you can get food in return, and so on. So you can use farm. If you have land, then you can use it both for your own cultivation as well as for exchange and so on. But they have also identified a couple of pathways which I want to focus on, which actually link gender or women's work and care with this nutrition. So first is the three, and I'll talk about each of these. One is about this whole idea that, if you do work, if you do agricultural work, then you automatically control the earnings and the decision making. And I'll talk a little bit about this. Secondly, that when women are engaged in agricultural work, even if they have earnings and so on, but there is a trade-off with time. Because if you remember my box when I presented about nutrition security, you also then need to convert that work or that income into food. And this is majority of this is women's work. And third is that when women, and of course in rural areas, unlike in farming households, women are working till the last moment when they are pregnant. They don't sit at home, with maternity leave and so on. They're working till the last moment, and 1 week after the child is born, they resume work. And of course, this means that they're spending a lot of extra energy on both farm work and domestic tasks. And how is that going to affect their own health? So if we move to the next, I'll just give you some examples from my own work and research. So one thing is that in India, we find that when women are working in agriculture, of course, the landless households, the Dalit households are going for agricultural labor, and a lot of small and marginal farmer households are also. But a majority of women, including in Kori, in OBC communities and so on, who are working on land, they have small and marginal holdings, 1 acre, 2 acres, 3 acres. Actually, they are working full time. And they're managing, because now many of their men are migrating to Surat, to here and there for work. But these women are almost single-handedly taking care of farming. But within our statistics, the classification used in the National Sample Survey is unpaid household workers. So rather than calling them as farmers, they are counted how much work they are doing, but they are labeled as unpaid household helpers. Now, this is very interesting because, first of all, it shows the value that we give it. From, when you think about somebody as an unpaid household worker, okay, you're acknowledging that that person is a worker. But you're saying, first of all, household, some kind of gharelu work, in local language, we'll say, wo to gharelu kaam karte hain. घर में काम करते हैं, वो महिला घर का काम करती है, even though it is managing the whole farm. So we automatically devalue that work. Secondly, there is no income attached to it, and therefore it is unpaid. So this empowerment effect that we might see, that women have control over income, which they can then exchange, decide what to do, what food to buy, this is not there. The second thing is that a lot of women's work is very labor intensive, lot of drudgery. When we talk about mechanization of agriculture, tractors, harvesters, the big machinery is really to support men's work in agriculture. Because I don't say that men don't work. Men work in agriculture. But it's interesting that because of this mechanization of men's work, actually it has come to the help of women, because now men are migrating. I did a research in UP, Banaras, very patriarchal. The men are all sitting in Surat. These women are managing. The reason that they are managing is that if it was old plow method, they wouldn't have been able to farm, because there is a lot of taboo that women can't plow. But because there's all tractors, so they can simply pay cash, which the husband sends, And then they can employ the tractor wala, he come plow my land and go. And then other activities she can take care of. So I think in a way it's worked to women's advantage. They're able to independently manage farms, because some of the most labor intensive but also drudgery involving and male tasks have been mechanized. But of course, this then women's tasks have not been mechanized, and this involves could potentially have negative effects on women's health. And of course, the third whole thing is, which has not changed, which is that the whole burden of domestic and care work. I didn't have time just before this, but the Government of India has recently come up with the latest time use survey. I think 3-4 days ago, the time use survey 2000-page document has been released, but which still shows. But I have the figures from the earlier time use survey, which was done 20 years ago, which was that, of total work, if we calculate, forget about paid and unpaid, you just take note of every minute of work that is done through the day, that for everybody, then actually women were doing 53% of all work. And my small studies show that this has actually increased. Next slide, please. Okay, this was just an example from my work in Santhal Parganas, that, the seasonal work, of course, this migration is there, but of course, women's migration is also there for paddy work. And this year they had gone for potato harvest. And of course, with COVID, they got stuck. And I'll come back to this example. I have written about it in Nature India, and I can share the link later. But basically, they go for Aloo Jom, this potato harvest March. They had gone to West Bengal. And then, of course, lockdown came. There was no transport. Normally with this, they are paid both in cash and kind. But because the transport was not there, so they had to leave their bora of potato, which they had been paid as harvest, and just come back with some cash and also walk back. They had to walk back. And therefore, they got kind of cheated in terms of what they were able to earn. Again, a devaluation or insensitivity to women's work. Next. And this is, of course, Nariga. And I think Nariga has been great in terms of providing employment opportunities to women. But from a food and nutrition security perspective, I think, again, the point about strenuous physical labor in relation to what women are eating. But at the same time, they're going to work on these Nariga sites. This is also from April, actually from Udaipur, where, again, men had just stuck in Gujarat, but they came back. They were very traumatized and tired, and they could not work. And women all went to the Nariga sites in April, May, June. Strenuous physical labor, but also then they have to come back and do all the household work. Next. So this care dimension is, again, something which remains invisible. So this was a time use and diet survey which I had done as part of Landsat. It was a small sample. But what we found is that women were performing, actually the earlier time use survey showed 53% of all work. And what we found is that women were performing 56% of total work. So when we think about the peak agricultural seasons, that actually in these areas, not that many men were migrating at that time in Jharkhand and in tribal areas of Odisha and so on. The idea is that men stay for the plowing because they don't have, it's sort of undulating land, and they use, they don't have that much tractor use except in the lowlands. So men stay for the plowing and only then go out. So they were also participating. But still, if men were doing 10 hours of work, women were doing 8 hours of work in farming. This was the kind of work that they were doing. But apart from that, they had to come back home and do 3 to 4 hours of domestic work, firewood, cooking on the chulha or wherever it is, and feeding the children, cleaning the bartan, vessels, clothes, all this kind of thing. So women's working days were almost 12 to 13 hours. And what they could not compromise on the agricultural work because it's a very seasonal activity. So what they did was during these peak seasons, they were doing 95% of domestic work. During these peak seasons, they actually cut down on domestic work by 30%. How did they cut down? So either they let small children feed themselves. So I have seen 3-year-old, 4-year-old children, toddlers, actually feeding themselves instead of the mother feeding. So she gives on a thali, but half the food goes on the floor, on the mitti, and only half the food goes into the child's mouth. So the portion she has given, but actually we can see the impacts on food and nutrition, that the child is not able to eat enough because the mother is not feeding enough. Similarly, she asks a 5-year-old to feed a 1-year-old. And how that child is going to feed is also a question mark. So I think this has implications. And their women's time is really because they just don't have the time. And we also found, we took weight, and we also found that actually women are encountering seasonal body loss weight, a body weight loss of almost 3 to 4% of body weight. These women are already very thin. So I'm talking of these adult women who are like 35 to 40 kgs in weight in tribal areas. So they're already very thin or underweight. And on top of that, then with very heavy work and not having time to cook, eating just bhat without anything. And these women said, कि हम भात के साथ इमली का चटनी बना लेते हैं, मिर्ची खा लेते हैं, chilies, because they don't have time to cook vegetables or to cook dal or to go to the fields and collect green leafy vegetables. Everything is available in these tribal areas, but women don't have time. That is the bottom line. And we have done nothing to address this problem of time poverty. Next, please. And the final thing I will just very quickly rush through, I think, because we have already spent a lot of time, is that apart from this, work is one issue which I really wanted to emphasize, that the devaluation of work, the invisibility of women's work, with all that we say, it continues to be. I think wages, we have reached some kind of parity, but we don't look at the intensity of the work, at the intensity of the labor. What else are women doing? We have not done much to support their domestic work. So I said domestic work is very time consuming. You see, a lot has been made of Ujjwala scheme, gas has been given, cooking gas has been given, and so on. The fact of the matter is that one cooking gas cylinder is given free of cost. And apart from that, you have to pay. Even with subsidy, you have to pay 400 rupees for a cooking gas cylinder. People who have got it in rural areas, they keep it for essential. If some guest comes, we will make chai on that cooking gas cylinder. It is an emergency. It is not for their everyday use. So many of these things we have not thought through properly in terms of how do we actually support to reduce the drudgery of both domestic labor as well as paid work. And this is because we don't give proper thinking to domestic labor. I think there are issues around, I don't have time, in resource access, of course, in terms of discriminatory laws, in terms of access to land, in terms of access to water has become a very big issue, access to credit. And I think it's very interesting that I did a study of Kisan credit cards, and only 2 to 4% of women have actually Kisan credit cards. And as I said, women are doing 70 to 80% of the work that men do in farming, even if not this equal to men. So they are farmers. But still, the access to credit is very much linked to land titles, which is mostly in men's names. I think exclusion from farmers' cooperatives, informal employment. And I think recently we are seeing that they might have some kind of reform of the labor codes to give some social protection to informal sector workers or informal workers, like these women workers in agriculture are all informal workers. They're not formal sector workers. But will they get any kind of social protection like maternity entitlements in particular, I think remains to be seen. The lack of adequate childcare and healthcare services. And this has been, I think, with COVID, I think this has really got exposed, that whatever little there was with Anganwadi centers and health centers and so on, completely came to a standstill because of COVID. And this is going to have, I think the predictions in India are that there's going to be a spike in pregnancy after COVID because of lack of family planning, because all these health centers and Anganwadi centers and so on, which were giving family planning services, everything was stopped. Only focus was on COVID response, tracking, tracing, and so on. So there will be a spike in pregnancy. There will be a spike. Immunization has been at a standstill for the last 6 months. So there will be a spike in diseases which we had thought we have eliminated, and so on. And of course, violence. And I've called this food violence. That, this in NFHS 4, one of the reasons for violence being high but being acceptable is that women give also, and women see it as reasonable or acceptable to be beaten if there is no proper food on the table, or if they have not cooked properly, these are seen as acceptable things, that husband got angry and he beat me because there was no proper food or I had not cooked properly. And now in the context of COVID, we see that of course people have lack of access to food, meals are reduced, and this is one reason also that violence has kind of shot up, because of this frustration of lack of adequate food of basic needs. Next, please. So I want to wind up with a couple of things around COVID. Some I have already mentioned. That when we go back to our food security framework, we see, availability, access, and so on. As Dr. Shailendra said in the beginning, that, we've had good food stocks, and therefore the PDS has distributed well of basic cereals, some pulses and oil. For the first 3 months, this was then extended by another 2 months. But after August, actually, this has been discontinued. And things are not really back to normal. So we see migrant workers coming back despite cases of COVID rising. And partly, what will they do? How will they earn? Because these free rations, the extra that had been given for 5 months, has now been stopped. Second, of course, access. And I think much was reported about this, about the disruptions of value market chains, supply chains, alongside reduced purchasing power. People lost jobs and incomes, but also there were market disruptions. And especially for the healthy foods, like fruits, vegetables, eggs, meat, milk, pulses, healthy, nutritious diets really declined. I have already mentioned the disruption in midday meals, in Anganwadi work centers, and other food-based social protection. And for many children in rural India, the midday meal was not an additional meal. It was a replacement meal, where families could only cook 2 meals or 1 meal a day. Then the midday meal was a very essential meal. We have seen this. There's a lot of research. The children reported that they come to school hungry, and therefore the midday meal is their only meal. Now, with the stoppage of midday meal, some states have said that, okay, we are giving take-home rations. For me, again, from my previous, whatever I've been saying, my main problem with that is you're just adding to women's work. Fine, take-home rations is fine. You're giving some extra rations, but who's going to convert this into food? It has to be now the task of cooking that midday meal or cooking that extra food in the midday, because a lot of women in these societies and the tribal areas, they just eat the previous evening's rice, they soak it with water, and they eat that old fermented rice with some mirchi or chilies or something like that, and the children eat in school. So now this has become an extra burden. And of course, lack of water, sanitation, public health services has been a big issue. What are the implications on gender relations? And the next, please. I think most of these points I have already mentioned, that in our society, women have the primary responsibility within the gender division of labor for procuring food and feeding the family. This has led to enhanced stress. They have lost money, loss of jobs, incomes to purchase essential commodities. Therefore, they're not able to cook adequately. I think worrying for me from a resource point of view is that indebtedness and distress sale of assets to maintain households. Land mortgaging is one thing, but the only asset that women have is gold, which they get as their dowries, as their inheritance. A lot of this jewelry has been sold off. So there's no safety net for the future. Increased care burdens, violence, which I already spoke about, resulting from a neglect of sexual and reproductive health as well. And the final thing, whenever there's a crisis like this or shortages, we have a lot of other practices like child marriage, child trafficking, and so on, that gets increased. We don't yet know. But of course, all these affect the girl child the worst. Next. So I think what we need is really thinking about some systemic shifts in terms of, not really, if you really want to achieve food security and nutrition, business as usual is not going to work. We have to look at this as interconnected with other systems and sectors. So clearly it's linked to agriculture sector, it's linked to trade sector. That's why today you're finding a lot of opposition And I think rightfully so, from people's movements on, the restrictions on export, imports. There was this huge thing around onions that, just when farmers were getting good prices, then export was banned and the local prices crashed. So I think government policy in terms of trades, in terms of export, import, in terms of agriculture. So food security is a multi-sectoral issue. It's of health, it's of education, it's a multi-sectoral issue. Secondly, we cannot only focus on hunger and undernutrition, which is the purpose of the National Food Security Act, is to make sure that there is no hunger. So you give hunger, and undernutrition is basically calories or carbohydrates. So rice feed, pet bhar ke khana. So that is hunger. But we need to also focus on all forms of malnutrition and in their complex relation to each other, on anemia, on obesity, on healthy food, and so on. Because these all have effects on our health and on our body. I think there are also some more radical suggestions in terms of how do we move towards a radical transformation. And I think this was a bold statement. This slide is taken from our high-level panel of experts on the Commission of Food Security, where we've really recommended, and I think this will be discussed next week on the 15th, and it will be interesting to see what the states, member states, respond. But what we have recommended is a radical transformation of food systems as a whole. So really looking at the whole system in terms of trade, in terms of demography, in terms of markets, in terms of economic policy, in terms of agricultural policy, in terms of advertising, media, like what are we promoting on media? We're promoting 2-minute noodles and stuff like that, or kurkure or murmuras or whatever it is. We're not promoting healthy diets necessarily. And then also thinking about context-specific solutions. So I think, how do we really think about that India is a large country? You have tribal areas. This goes back to my point on equality and gender equality and recognizing diversity. That if we really want to move towards taking seriously on board, then we have to recognize different contexts, different food preferences, different needs, and prepare tailored solutions. So for tribal areas where there are no, tractors possible, it's a slopey terrain, how will we help in terms of ensuring food security and nutrition? We really need this. Okay, next, please. I think I just want to conclude now. I think this is a paper which I can share with you, but I will move to the next. This was a paper in Nature Food. It's a similar sort of an argument which I have made. Next, please. And I think I just want to leave with this, that when we then think of a policy framework, I think if you're thinking about addressing these issues, then we have to think about interrelations of, what I said earlier about recognition of women in whatever work they're doing, as farmers and agricultural workers, but also as care providers, as domestic workers. We have to recognize. And I think, again, COVID in one way, I feel, did a good thing, because it showed all these stars and celebrities doing cleaning of the house, jhadu pocha, that bai is not coming. So to some extent, some of these tasks, which we take so much for granted, got some visibility. A second element is around redistributing, as I said, not just resources, but also the care deficit. I think this is very important, that if we want to attain food security and nutrition, one thing is the food itself. Second thing is, how is that raw materials converted in terms of the care and the health practices? We need to think about that. We need to think about childcare services, about drug reducing technologies. And finally, I think representation is very important. I think we've done well with Panchayati Raj in India. But why is it stuck? I think this is a threat factor. I think for me, this is a clear indication that why is the act not going through Parliament in terms of reservation or quotas for women in Parliament and in legislative assemblies. The higher levels that you come in terms of decision making, there is still a threat factor in terms of giving equal opportunities and equal voice. And I think this is something that unless we address in an integrated way, we're not really going to achieve this radical transformation which we want. Sorry, I've taken a little bit longer than I had anticipated, but I'll just stop there. You can,
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your valuable insights. Hello, am I audible, ma'am?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was a very valuable session for all of us and understanding the context of um, malnutrition, food security with respect to the gender and the problems that we are facing currently. So thank you so much for sharing these learnings with us. We are very, very thankful to you ha- for being here. And over to you, Rajita, for the concluding remarks. Thank you.
Hello, ma'am. So it was a very insightful session, and there are lots of questions also and some comments also coming up in the chat box. So we got to learn new concepts like time poverty and meta preferences and the integration of different, the care and concepts like that, which we didn't know before. So that was a very insightful session, and we really have some questions also which we wanted to discuss, but at 8 o'clock we have another mandatory session by the management, so unfortunately we would have to leave. But if we have your permission, then we would like to mail the questions to you, mail the comments and the questions to you. So if you could find some time afterwards, would you be able to answer those questions through email?
Okay, sure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, and thank you so much,
Also, ma'am.
Shailendra.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shalendra sir, for your insights and the remarks. Uh, so thank you so much, ma'am. Also, some participants were also asking for the presentation if we can share it with them. So, if with your permission, if we
Okay.
can.
So let me. I think
Thank
we
you so
can
much.
PDF or something like that. We can discuss this on
Sure thing,
email.
ma'am.
You can share. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am.
Okay.